Today's talk is actually a book launch with a unique format. It involves a conversation with both our speakers, Sonia Shah, who's a science journalist, and Reece Jones, the author of the book that is being launched today. Sonia will essentially be interviewing Reece about this book. And as a bonus to this conversation, we will also hear from Sonia about her own book on migration. The hope is that together we will learn from both speakers, both the geographical feature of the border and all its implications, and the phenomena of migration. Just a little bit of housekeeping with respect to the event. I will introduce both speakers formally. They'll speak for about 40 minutes or so. Please add your questions to the Q&A box as you think of them, but remember to be specific because they'll answer those at the very end. We will monitor chat, but if it's a question, please use the Q&A box. I expect we will do about 30 minutes of questions, Q&A, and then we will close. The recording of the talk will be available for those who registered. We expect to send it out November 1st when we send out our monthly newsletter. So, and again, if you're not receiving the newsletter and you want to subscribe, there it is in the chat. Please click on that link and you can subscribe or send it to others who might be interested. Okay, on to the formal introductions. Dr. Reece Jones is a political geographer who studies the relationship between states, borders, and people on the move. He's a professor and current chair at the University of Hawaii at Mānoa's Department of Geography and Environment. Reece is a 2021 Guggenheim Fellow and the author of several award-winning books, including Violent Borders, published in 2016, and Border Walls, published in 2012. On a more personal note, Reece and I went to graduate school together at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, where we both studied geography there. I subsequently moved to the University of Hawaii at Mānoa to be their first Maps and GIS librarian. And we joke about how Reece followed me there, and I've been trying to get him to the Bay Area, not successful as yet. Yeah. Our second speaker is Sonia Shah. Sonia Shah is a science journalist and author of The Next Great Migration, The Beauty and Terror of Life on the Move, published by Bloomsbury in 2020. The finalist for the Pan E.O. Wilson Science Literary Writing Award, and another book, Pandemic, Tracking Contagions from Cholera to Coronaviruses and Beyond, published by Forrest Strauss and Giro, 2016. Among other books. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, the Washington Post, the Nation, Scientific American, and elsewhere. So now, without further ado, on to Sonia Shah and Reece Jones. Take it away.
Thank you, Salim, and hi, Reece. Nice seeing you, and happy book birthday. I think today is actually the day, right?
Yeah, today is the book launch. So yeah, it's exciting. It's out in the world. And Salim, I'll be waiting for the appointment to Stanford any day now. I'm sure it's just in the mail. I'll
Indeed,
I'd be happy to join you.
It is.
So Reece, I wanted to start by asking you to kind of put this book in the context of all your other books. So you have several books, many of which have the word border in the title: Violent Borders, Border Walls, and now this one, White Borders. So talk a little bit about what motivated you to take on this particular aspect of borders.
Yeah. Well, first, I also just want to thank you, Sonia, for joining us for this. I appreciate it. And I look forward to talking about your book during the conversation, which is really great. And thanks also to the Rumsey Map Center for having me, and for Stanford for inviting me for this. So, this book, White Borders, I started working on this during the Trump campaign. My last book, Violent Borders came out about a month before the election. And so I kind of watched that whole campaign happen, and was appalled to see these things that I'd been researching in terms of border walls, migration controls being used in such strong anti-immigrant ways, really racist ways. And it made me realize that I've worked mostly on borders through most of my career, but I hadn't really thought that deeply about immigration restrictions and how those had worked. And so what I decided to do at that time was to go back and look at the US's immigration laws from the beginning to understand that relationship between race and immigration, and to see how that developed, and whether Trump was something that was an aberration. Was it something that didn't fit with the history of the country? Or was it something that there were antecedents to in the citizenship and immigration law?
Yeah, that's great. And that, I mean, I think that's a good place to start too, which is, how do we understand our present moment? Is it anomalous? Is it aberrant, or is it sort of part of a longer history? And I think you unpack that really amazingly with such amazing detail and meticulously in this book. So congratulations. I mean, it's great, and I know I'm going to refer to it a ton moving forward. But we just saw recently, at the border, U.S.-Mexico border, all the people trying to get here from Haiti and summarily refused any opportunity to even claim asylum under the guise of, well, it's a public health problem, or we don't have the capacity to process these people. And yet then suddenly we see the administration very efficiently deport all these thousands of people to Haiti. So what do we make of this? I mean, there's a really common response of, well, this is not who we are. Like the pictures of the Border Patrol agents on horseback seeming to almost like whip these people away with the reins of the horses. And people found that really disturbing. And of course it was. But what you're arguing in this book is, well, that's the response of, well, that's not who we are. That's exactly wrong.
Yeah, exactly. I would say that's exactly who the United States is, based on the immigration laws throughout the history of the country. If you look at why the US has put in place immigration restrictions, it's consistently been to restrict the movement of non-white people into the country. I think people are often surprised to hear that the US did not have any national immigration laws when the country was founded, and did not have any for almost 100 years after 1776. It isn't until 1875 that the first immigration laws at the national level are passed. Now, there are some state level restrictions before that. Certainly, states like Massachusetts and New York had limits on the poor and the infirm, and southern states had limits on the movement of free Blacks entering those states. But the Supreme Court ruled those state level restrictions were unconstitutional in 1849 and again in 1875. So it's not until we see the arrival of the first non-white immigrants in large numbers to the United States that the US starts to have any restrictions at all on who can actually enter the country.
Right. So can you tell us a little bit more about what led to that? There's this 100-year period that you've outlined where, well, people are just coming and going however they like. And then suddenly things sort of start to change a lot. So can you just unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah, well, ostensibly we're in the Bay Area right now talking about this at Stanford, and a lot of that starts in California, right? It's the gold rush in 1849. There starts to be the arrival of Chinese immigrants to California. California becomes a state in 1850, and it becomes easier for people from China to make that trip to the West Coast. And more or less from the beginning, their arrival is met with anger and fear by white Americans moving from the Eastern US to the West Coast. So the issue of Chinese immigration becomes a major political issue across the West in the decades after that. And it's really West Coast politicians that bring this to become kind of a national political issue. I think, though, that the moment that it happens is not by chance. It's in the aftermath of the Civil War. And particularly, I argue in the book, it's the aftermath of Black citizenship that leads to this kind of consensus that something needs to be done about this Chinese immigration.
Right. But in that case, it was sort of explicitly racialized, right, at that time?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what we see after Black citizenship by 1870, freed slaves are given citizenship, there's this questioning in the white community of how to deal with this fact. And I think there are three main responses that we see. The first is violence towards people of color in the US at the time. Things like Jim Crow laws, the rise of the KKK, segregation that reimposes the racial order of the slavery period in that post-Reconstruction era. The second thing we see is efforts to remove non-white people from the country. There's a group called the American Colonization Society. It's established in the 1820s to move freed slaves back to Africa. The country of Liberia is closely tied to that. After the Civil War, that ramps up, and there's a lot of efforts to get the freed slaves to leave the country. And then the third response is the effort to not allow any more non-white people into the country. And if you look at the debates around the Chinese exclusion laws, the first one is the Page Act that passes in 1875, and then the Chinese Exclusion Act is in 1882. The debates about that are explicitly in racial terms. It's about the fact that, the founders imagined a white country. Citizenship was limited to free white person in the first naturalization law. And so the argument then was that the country shouldn't allow any more non-white people into the US.
And what's so interesting about this history too is the whole idea of whiteness was still really being formed at the same time, right? Like there was one time when Irish people weren't considered white, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing we should mention is that the first naturalization law in 1790 limited citizenship in the US to a free white person who'd been in the country for 2 years. And that phrase remained in US citizenship and naturalization law all the way until 1952. Which I think is really surprising to a lot of people. But you're right, exactly what that means was up for debate during this period of time. And there are groups of people that at one point aren't considered white and then kind of get brought into this definition of what is white. So in the book, I talk about a number of cases that are considered in the courts where people from a wide range of different places applied for citizenship in the 1890s, 19-teens, 1920s. And the courts had to decide, are they white or not? Because there was no real definition in there. And I recount a number of these cases where in some instances, people from South Asia, from India are considered white, but then in other instances, they're not, right? So there are all these contested issues. It finally reaches the Supreme Court in 1922 with the case of Tequila Ozawa. And the Supreme Court decides white means Caucasian from Europe. Right. And then it's reconfirmed in 1923 in the Tind case. So up until that moment, though, that had not really been defined exactly what the law meant in terms of white.
So he kind of talk a little bit about that character. I mean, he kind of fell through the cracks because on one hand, there already were all these laws that specifically targeted Chinese people, right? So they were already understood as not white, but there was a question about him.
Yeah, absolutely. So Tequila Ozawa was born in Japan. And so what we see over and over again, each time the US limits one non-white group, starting with the Chinese exclusion laws, different groups of people start to arrive and work in the same sorts of jobs that the banned people were working in before. And so the Japanese increase in numbers in migrating to the US in the years after that. And Japanese migration is banned in 1907 with the Gentleman's Agreement, but Tequila Ozawa came before that. He went to the University of California at Berkeley for his degree. Then he moved to Hawaii. His children were born in Hawaii. They're citizens at birth because of birthright citizenship. And he speaks English fluently. He works for an American company. And so he says, I'm an American and I should be able to become a citizen like my children are. But when he applies for it, it's denied. And so they keep contesting it, and it eventually reaches the Supreme Court. He makes this argument that Benedict Arnold was an American by citizenship, but not a true American, right? But he calls himself a true American, even though he's not recognized as one. But the argument doesn't work, and his citizenship is denied.
And that was in 1920 sometime, right? You said
1922.
Right. And so 1922. So by that time, I mean, the whole kind of context of how people were understanding immigration and the dangers and the hazards it might pose had really changed. So can you talk a little bit about that movement at, in that 1920s, sort of early 20th century time period?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's that moment I mentioned before, this kind of reconsidering of race after Reconstruction. I think we see in universities at the turn of the century an effort to kind of create a theoretical explanation for the racial hierarchies that have developed in the country. And this race pseudoscience develops during this period of time. We use the phrase eugenics to describe it now. I think we don't realize now how widespread these views were at the time, but these were widely held views that white people were genetically superior to other people around the world. And so the real question during then the 19-teens and 1920s wasn't whether white people were superior to Black or Asian people, but rather whether there were different classifications within Europe. And so there's an important book in 1916 called The Passing of the Great Race by Madison Grant. The book goes on to sell over 1 million copies, but he breaks up the races of Europe into the superior Nordic race, which he calls the white man par excellence, and then other Central and Southern Europeans as being less worthy. And so that book is hugely influential in the 1924 Immigration Act, which continues to ban Asian immigration completely, but it also creates strict limits on Southern and Eastern European immigration, with the idea that only Nordic Europeans should be able to immigrate to the United States.
Mm-hmm. Right. And Madison Grant brings up another really interesting sort of entanglement, which is that we think of sort of this, the white supremacist anti-immigration movement today as sort of right-wing and populist, but its roots are kind of the opposite of that, and you talk about this in the book, that the roots of this movement really are, on one hand, elite, there's a lot of elite connections. And then also there's even connections in what we would now consider kind of left-leaning movements. And I think Madison Grant kind of characterizes some of that, but can you talk a little bit about those other kind of unexpected roots of the movement we're seeing today?
Yeah, this is something that I didn't completely understand before I started to really do the research for this book. But there's this over and over again, there's this connection between environmentalists and white supremacy, which is something I hadn't quite grasped. And Madison Grant is certainly an example of that. His earlier work was about creating protected areas in the West for endangered species. So like the American bison, right? So arguing for national parks and things like that. And he's a close ally with Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt writes an endorsement on the back cover of this book. But what his insight is essentially in The Passing of the Great Race is that the Nordic white people are like an endangered species. And so what the US needs is immigration restrictions to prevent these other races of people from damaging this pure white race that they have in America at the time. And you might think that I'm exaggerating, but I mean, this is literally what they're saying on the Senate floor in the lead up to the vote. A senator from South Carolina recommends Madison Grant's book. Teddy Roosevelt at the time said that immigration could result in race suicide in the United States. Kind of similar to what we hear today from people like Tucker Carlson in terms of the idea that immigrants are going to replace white people. Tucker Carlson called immigration that could result in the extinction of the white race. So there's a long history of using that sort of language to describe immigration. And it's very much rooted in white supremacy.
So this, and then this gets kind of pulled forward through the person of John Tanton, and others. But can you talk a little bit about? I mean, he's known as the most famous guy you never heard of, or the most influential guy you've never heard of, something like that, because he's had a huge footprint on the anti-immigration movement in this country over really decades, and with kind of incredible power today in our current moment. So talk a little bit about John Tanton and how he kind of also came out of, concerns about the environment and population growth in, 1960s and 1970s.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in order to understand Tanton, we first have to just think briefly about that period between 1924 and 1965. So I mentioned already that in 1952, free white person was finally removed from citizenship law. So after that, there could be no discrimination based on race or ethnicity in granting citizenship. And it's part of the civil rights movement. And that continues through 1965 when those racist, eugenics-based immigration laws are finally taken off the books with a revision to the Immigration and Nationalities Act. So Tanton arrives on the scene after that. So at the beginning of the 1970s, late 60s, early 1970s, the environmental movement is really taking off in the US. Tanton was widely involved in the first Earth Day in 1970, and he was particularly worried about population growth. And the idea, the population bomb, which is a book by Paul Ehrlich, a Stanford professor, that argued that population growth was going to outstrip the ability of the Earth to the capacity to have people survive in food production. And so Tanton was really taken by this idea. He becomes a close associate of Ehrlich's. Ehrlich has a group called Zero Population Growth. John Tanton becomes the president of that group. And by the mid-1970s, Tanton has decided that it's not just population growth that's a threat to the United States, but that its immigration specifically is a threat to the US environment. And so he believes that in order to protect the American environment, there needs to be strict movement restrictions to prevent too many people from coming into the country. He finds, though, in the 70s that there are not many people that are really talking about this in the same sort of ways. And so he decides that he himself needs to do this, to create these organizations to bring this issue to the forefront of American politics. It's a long shot story, right? John Tanton was an ophthalmologist in upstate Michigan. He lives in Petoskey, Michigan. Over his career, he did over 4,000 eye surgeries, right? So he's working full time as an eye doctor, but he somehow finds the time to also start this fleet of anti-immigrant groups that today, 40 years later, we find have completely transformed the way the US talks about immigration.
And he also had a real stroke of luck, which is in finding financing. So can you talk a little bit about that aspect of his unlikely success?
Yeah. So John Tanton donated all of his papers to the University of Michigan. And about half of them are publicly available right now. So we can look at what he was doing during this period and who he was talking to. And what we see there is just this tireless worker who was writing dozens of letters per day to people to find allies for his anti-immigrant movement, but specifically to find money to support it. An early supporter he finds is Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett gives over $1 million to Tanton network groups. Warren Buffett sat on the board of directors of his first group that he founded, the Federation of American Immigration Reform, which goes by FAIR. But the real coup for John Tanton is to become a close associate of Cordelia Scaife May. Cordelia Scaife May was one of the wealthiest people in the United States. She's a Mellon heir. In the 1990s, she was said to be the wealthiest woman in the US, but she was also reclusive and had very strong population growth views and conservation views. And so throughout the 1980s and 1990s, Tanton is cultivating Cordelia Scaife May so that by the time she passes away in 2005, She set up a foundation called the Colcom Foundation, and she leaves over $420 million to that foundation. And the mission statement of that foundation is to pursue anti-immigrant laws in the United States. And so that donation has meant hundreds of millions of dollars flowing to these anti-immigrant groups that Tanton set up in the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s.
And these groups, I mean, you have these amazing charts in the book of like just all the groups that John Tanton helped found, and it takes up pages. And of course, many of these groups have become really powerful, but also have spawned a whole generation of policymakers who have, ascended to the highest reaches of government under the Trump administration in particular. Can you talk a little bit about that and why is that so poorly understood?
Yeah, well, so an insight that Tanton had in the 1980s was that one, he needed money to do this, and he definitely succeeded in getting that. But then secondly, he realized he couldn't just have one organization. So what he did was found dozens of groups, but they're all started by him and they're funded by Cordelia Scaife May. But it seems like there are these dozens of separate groups that are all arguing for the same thing in the 1980s. So what you see, if you're the audience probably can remember a lot of these things happening. English only laws in the 1980s and 1990s. Those are Tanton organization groups that are doing that. Prop 187 in California, funded by Tanton network groups. The defeat of comprehensive immigration reform in 2007, and then again in 2014 in Congress. In both of those instances, the consensus was in the media that this was going to pass easily, right? The Republicans supported it, the Democrats supported it. In 2007, George Bush even supported it, but it failed, right? And at the time, it was confounding. What happened here? Tanton Network is behind that. They put together this widespread effort to influence Republican politicians to not vote for this thing. And so time after time, they spot any sort of effort to open up more immigration to the United States or provide a pathway to citizenship for people who are currently in the country, and they defeat those things. And so they have been hugely influential in doing that. So the main groups, so there's FAIR, the Federation for American Immigration Reform. There's another group called the Center for Immigration Studies. They all have these really banal names that make it seem like they're just think tanks, but they're not. Another one is Numbers USA, which does a lot of the grassroots organizing. There's one called Californians for Population Stabilization, Progressives for Immigration Reform. All of these are funded by the Colcom Foundation and are founded by John Tanton. And they work together to pursue this anti-immigrant agenda. One last thing I should mention about these groups is that it's not just me saying that they have kind of a nativist view behind what they're doing. The Southern Poverty Law Center has investigated these groups, and the majority of them are designated hate groups by the Southern Poverty Law Center. So in the Southern Poverty Law Center's view, they're equivalent to the Aryan Nation, to the KKK. They treat them the same way. What's happened, though, is these groups have these regular sounding names. The people running them aren't wearing, white hoods. They're wearing suits, right? They talk like think tank people. And so they've been able to infiltrate the public discourse in a way that many of the other hate groups have not been able to do. And a key factor, of course, in that is that hundreds of millions of dollars in money flowing into their coffers from the Mellon fortune.
And then a lot of these people become quite influential in the Trump administration. Can you talk a little bit about, it's almost as if there was this long period where policymakers felt they could talk openly about race being an important aspect of our immigration regime. And then maybe from the 60s until, the Trump administration, we sort of kept doing a lot of those things, but kind of under the radar and not using this like openly racialized rhetoric. But then in the Trump administration, we sort of see the same language coming back up again, the replacement theory, these same ideas that hark back to decades ago. Can you talk a little bit about, how that has happened, and how it is that we have not been able, we haven't been able to match our policy with our rhetoric. We have this rhetoric, or a nation of immigrants, or a melting pot, all this stuff. And yet, the Trump administration comes in and they're talking as if they're back in the 1920s again.
Yeah. So in the book, I make the case that the Tanton Network is a key player in that. So throughout that period in the 70s through the 2000s, Tanton is, of course, courting these donors, but he's also conversing with white supremacists. In his papers at the University of Michigan, there are dozens of letters back and forth with white supremacists of that era and people like Jared Taylor today, who is still a key white supremacist thinker. So the effort of this Tanton network of groups, of CIS, of FAIR, of Numbers USA, is to sanitize these white supremacist views and bring them into the public discourse. And they did that through the Republican Party. So in the book, I look at what were the connections that produced this transformation. Jeff Sessions is the first key person. So Jeff Sessions was a senator, of course, from Alabama. In the early 2000s, Roy Beck, who was the founder of Numbers USA, one of the Tanton network groups, met with Jeff Sessions and convinced him to be a more forceful voice against immigration. And he becomes kind of the center of that thinking in the Senate and drives that defeat of those comprehensive immigration reforms. He goes to Tanton Network meetings all the time. He speaks at these groups. He's closely tied to these hate groups. In about 2012, he hires Stephen Miller into his office. And so Stephen Miller becomes his conduit to these hate groups. Stephen Miller gives a keynote speech at a Center for Immigration Studies event, and then he gets hired right into the Trump campaign, right? And so he becomes Trump's speechwriter. A few years ago, a lot of Stephen Miller's emails were leaked to the press from about a 1-year period just before he joined the Trump campaign to about a year into it. And during that period of time, he emailed a Tanton Network hate group at least once a week during that entire period, where he was getting information for them, taking their ideas and putting them directly into speeches in the Trump administration. Then, of course, Trump wins. And these figures tied to these hate groups become the key players in his administration. In the book, I detail over a dozen people who used to work at one of these hate groups who get hired in to work in the Department of Justice, Department of Homeland Security, in the White House itself. And then a dozen more figures in the Trump presidency give speeches at these hate groups during their time in office. So it really is essentially Tanton Network takeover of the Trump presidency.
And so moving forward from there, so we sort of have come, gone really quickly through this history that you lay out so well in the book. But let's move a little beyond the book, which is to look just your thoughts on the Biden administration and how much of a departure is the Biden administration's approach to immigration compared to the Trump administration. I mean, on one hand, of course, it seems very different. The rhetoric is really different, but is the policy actually different? And if so, how much?
Yeah, I think it hasn't been as different as we might hope that it would be. I mean, in the lead up to his presidency, Biden talked about reversing a lot of these policies and bringing a humane approach back. I think his policy is actually called a humane policy for a nation of immigrants, right? But in practice, he hasn't done that yet. So emblematic of that is this year, the US let in the lowest number of refugees ever since the Refugee Act passed in 1980. And the Biden administration had 7 months to rectify that and to increase the numbers. Similarly, they've continued to use Title 42 to remove people from the United States without considering their asylum claims like they're supposed to do by law. You mentioned the Haitian families at the border last month. The majority of them were removed exactly in that manner. Rather than hearing their request for asylum, they were just simply flown to Haiti based on Title 42, which is supposedly a healthcare regulation. So it's been a disappointing administration for sure. The hopes that they would do more to reverse this and to see migration as a positive is something that just hasn't happened in this administration. We've talked a lot about my book. I want to throw this back to you just a little bit because your book is excellent, right? I've got my copy right here. I was able to read an early version of this book several years ago, and I know the paperback just came out last week. And what's so great, I think, about your book is that you force us to question a lot of our assumptions about immigration and borders and maps, right? I mean, this is we're speaking at a map library, and I think one of the things that has done a lot to shape the way that we perceive movement is the use of maps, because maps have these fixed lines on them. It makes it seem like these countries have always been there, and that groups of people should be able to restrict the movement of other people at those edges. But of course, in your book, you argue that not only have humans been moving everywhere for all of our history, but so have other animals and plants. So why don't you talk a little bit about that argument you make in the book?
Yeah, I mean, we go over some of this. Our books overlap a little bit, but my context is to try to build an affirmative case for migration as an adaptive response to dynamism, to a changing planet. And so I bring in non-human species for that reason, because our responses to them are in some ways similar, but in some ways different. In some ways, new species moving into novel places, people say, oh, invasives, we don't want them, rip them all out. I mean, that from being in Hawaii, that's sort of the capital of this problem of invasion of wild species. In fact, only 10% of species that are introduced into new places can actually hold on and get established, and only 10% of those actually become invasive in terms of causing damage or unwanted effects of any kind. So really 1% of species that move into new places actually cause any kind of problems, which is not dissimilar to, the way we think about immigration and crime or security, where it's this tiny, tiny fraction. Actually, fewer immigrants cause those problems than people in sort of already resident places. But wild species are moving right now because of climate change, and they're moving into new places in sync with the changing climate, shifting farther north up into the mountains. And it is widely understood among sort of biologists and conservationists that this is a really good thing. Like, this is how we're going to preserve biodiversity into the future. We want this. Let's not build walls. Let's build bridges. Let's make corridors so that these creatures can move, because we want them to be able to survive. But then the same thing, humans are doing, right? Like, people are moving, or people will need to move because of, sea level rise and desertification and, superstorms and all of these things that are happening because of the climate crisis. And yet what we're doing in that case is really pull up the ladders, build the wall, trap people in places that are becoming uninhabitable. And so, I think the question then becomes like, well, what's worse, right? Like, we have this kind of myth that we can turn migration off. It's like a faucet. Oh, we don't want those people, turn it off. Oh, we want some of those, turn it on a little bit. And I think what migration is much broader than that. It's a behavior that we're not going to be able to stop. And you talk about this in your other books too, Reece, about, the more borders you build, the bigger walls you build, you don't end migration, you just divert it, and in fact it becomes more deadly, which maybe that's a place we can kind of end, is kind of looking at this in an international context. You talk in the book about how the very peculiar American racial hierarchy has informed our immigration policy, which has led to this border wall building, whether metaphorically or in real life. But at the same time, this is happening all over the world. There's more borders that are fortified with walls and fences and all the rest than at any time before. So, but those places don't have the same sort of racial hierarchies that we have. And yet the outcomes are the same. So how do you kind of make sense of that?
Yeah, I think that in some ways, a lot of places follow what the US is doing, right? That the US sets an agenda in terms of what's appropriate and what's not. And that tends to get followed in other places. And I think wall building is an example of that the US was on the front end of building walls, of putting up all the security at borders. And we see a similar trend in other places around the world. I'd like to think even a little broader, though, and this is where I think our books intersect, is to just question the entire idea of restricting movement at a border. It's something that is not a historical norm, right? It's not something that's existed for long periods of time. And if what I argue in my book is, if you look at why has the US done it, the origins of it was racism, was right to protect a white country. Right. The first immigration law is to prevent Chinese from entering the United States. The U.S. didn't have any border patrols until the first is in 1904, and they're mounted Chinese inspectors who ride from town to town looking for Chinese people to kick out of the country. The Border Patrol isn't established until 1924, 2 days after those eugenics-based national origin quotas are put into place. So the entire premise of restricting the movement of other human beings into the United States is based on white supremacy, right? So if we question white supremacy, if we think that that's something that the country should be leaving behind, I would suggest we should also be leaving behind restrictions on immigration, because that's what they're founded on. But you're right. If we look at what's happening globally right now, we see the other trend occurring, right? We see countries around the world enclosing themselves based on these ideas of a nation, based on these imagined lines on maps, right? It's cartographers that create these lines on maps. They draw a line, but then those things become so powerful in our imagination to create these inside-outside spaces of who belongs where and who doesn't. And you're right to suggest that for the next 5 to 10 years, I think we're going to see a lot more violence at borders, unfortunately, and a lot of countries turning to walls, turning to stronger border forces, and honestly killing a lot more people who are simply just trying to move from one place to another.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that always strikes me is this idea that, well, if you don't have a border enclosing a space, then that place somehow doesn't exist. You know, there's this idea that, like, well, if you don't have a border, it's like we won't have integrity as a nation, we won't exist. You know, you have to have these lines drawn around places. And yet, you know, I mean, we have New York City, there's a borders around it, but they're completely permeable and it still exists. So it's sort of this, you know, this weird idea we have that if we don't sort of carve off a place, that somehow that place will have no more integrity. It just will fall apart.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a bizarre notion, I think, in a way, right? But it's a very powerful one that has, you know, Trump would say that same thing, right? He would say, if you don't have borders, you don't have a country. But the U.S. didn't have immigration restrictions for 100 years, right? And it seemed to have continued as a country. And in fact, it was expanding during that period of time as it displaced other people around the world. So, you know, it's a bizarre notion. I would suggest, and I think you make the same sort of case in your book, that really we should be thinking about a future that doesn't continue to have those sorts of restrictions, that a more just world would be a world where people are free to move across the surface of the earth like they have done for thousands of years beforehand, right? The thing that's unusual, the thing that's the anomaly historically, is the idea of these bounded spaces, of these enclosed maps of countries that can restrict the movement of people at their edges. That's the thing that's abnormal in history.
Would you say then that, you know, what I always say is it's not that you want, you know, open borders sort of implies this lawlessness. Anyone can come anytime, you know. I mean, you could still have, do you see a future of, you still have some kind of management system, right? Like you have some way to make migration safe, humane, dignified. Maybe even you could think about the pace, the direction. You know, there's ways in which you kind of shape migration as a community, as a society, but isn't about sort of, okay, you're in, you're out. We're gonna build this wall and pull up the ladders.
Yeah, I think so. I think something that always seems to get lost when we talk about immigration is that it's a benefit to the countries that receive it. There have been so many economic studies about immigration, and they are uniformly positive, right? They suggest that as more people come, more jobs are created, more income comes into that place. And it makes sense if you think about it, right? If each new person that immigrates, they don't just do the job that they're doing, but they go to the store, they take a taxi, right? They rent an apartment, right? All of those things contribute to other people's jobs, right? So studies suggest that for each immigrant, 1.2 additional jobs are created by them. So I think there's a case to make for open immigration. And just like you talked about, in the US, we already have a system like that, right? I live in Hawaii, and I pay taxes in Hawaii. I've got a driver's license in Hawaii. I follow Hawaii's laws, right? We have quite strict gun laws here in Hawaii, for example, that are quite different from other places. We have high taxes in Hawaii, but I'm free to move to Texas. And if I moved to Texas, I would follow Texas's laws. I would get a driver's license in Texas, and I would be a resident of Texas, right? The ability to do that does not end, as you suggested, the existence of Texas or Hawaii as concepts, right? So the idea of moving freely across the space of the earth, I think, is something that in the medium to longer term is a policy goal that will have a lot of benefits for a lot of people globally. And when we look at the number of people that are likely to be displaced by climate change, by environmental change, there's gonna be a lot of movement coming in the next few decades. And to me, the radical answer would be to put up walls and to use violence against those people. The more humane thing to do would be to find a safe and managed way for people to move across the face of the earth.
I mean, it's interesting, this concept of who gets to move. Mimi Scheller had that idea of mobility capital, that some people have the capital that allows them to go wherever they want to, or to think that they can, at least. You hear a lot of people, particularly white Americans say, oh, well, if such and such happens, I'm moving to France, I'm moving to Canada. And it's like, well, you think you can just go wherever you want, And this idea of like, who has that capital, and how is that constructed, that it's this combination of sort of the color of your face and your ethnicity and your money and your papers you have, and, all these things kind of wrapped up together.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. In some ways, that's what my previous book, Violent Borders, is thinking about, is the ways that privileges are protected by borders, right? That in that book, I talk about economic privileges that are protected, but there's also racial or cultural privileges bound up in those same sorts of ideas. I think in some ways the pandemic has been a bit of a comeuppance for many Americans, because there was a period of time there where Americans could only go to like 5 or 6 places, right? So because the country managed the pandemic so poorly. So it suggests that maybe those ideas of being able to move so freely are not as permanent as people kind of think they are.
Yeah, that's really interesting. One of the other thing I want to ask you about is social movements. We've seen the kind of racial justice movement become really powerful in the last few years. And then the immigration reform movement, which they've been somewhat separate. I mean, there's some overlap, but it's been somewhat separate. And I think it was actually Jon Stewart who said, well, what are the police except for Border Patrol, but in the interior to police Black communities against white communities? I thought that's such an interesting way to put it, and really kind of is what your book is about more generally, right? Like, and do you see those two movements coming together? Is the framework you're presenting a way to do that? What are those possibilities there?
Yeah. I think over the last few years, a lot of people have come to see policing in racial terms, right? And understand that as a racial phenomenon. What I'm trying to do with this book is to make us think about immigration restrictions in that same sort of way. Because for whatever reason, I don't feel like that's the first thing that comes to mind for a lot of people when they think about immigration laws. for whatever reason, we still tend to perceive immigration laws as if they're something that is just normal, that it's something that all countries do, and it's kind of a benign function of the state. I think people talked about police like that for a long period of time, but they're starting to really question that and see it through a different sort of lens. And I think you have to see immigration in the same sort of way, right? It's the mechanism through which a state, as an entity that controls a land and a people and the resources, limits the access of other people to those particular places, right? And in the US, that history is a history of racial exclusion. And so I think we definitely should see the police and the border guards as really being two hands of the same entity. Another thing that tends to happen as well is that the borders often tend to be places where the more extreme types of policing are tested out and then make their way back to local police afterwards. And so there are a lot of connections between border policing and policing more generally.
I think there was a question in the chat about digital passports, which were introduced, I think, in Estonia. Can you talk a little bit about how would you envision a system that would be more fair, more open, allow people to move freely across borders? What would that actually look like?
Yeah, so passports are something that are new. Right? They're not that old that we've had passports. The US did not require passports to enter the country until after World War II. And in Europe, they only became common after World War I. One thing that was really striking to me that illustrates this, in 1882, when the Chinese Exclusion Act passed Congress, the first time it passed, the president at the time, Chester Arthur, vetoed it. And the reason he vetoed the Chinese Exclusion Act was because the requirement for Chinese residents to come into the United States was to have a passport. And he thought that was way too onerous of a requirement. So he vetoed it, sent it back to Congress, and they changed it to just a certificate for people to enter the United States, right? So the idea of passports is a new thing, right? It's a new phenomenon. It's something that's been invented to protect those privileges that have accrued in particular states. So it's not something that has a long history as a way of ordering the movement of people. It's a mechanism very similar to an immigration law or to a border wall that is used to restrict those movements of people. The digital passports question, I'm not sure I don't know a ton about that specific thing, so I'm not sure I can speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting when I was in Bahamas after Hurricane Dorian, and the Haitian community there was hit really hard because they were living in sort of all these low-lying areas. Many of them died. There's probably going to be no good accounting of how many people died. But the people who survived, they, of course, Bahamas is all 3 feet above sea level. So it's just, there's nowhere to go, really. You have to kind of cross an international border to get to safer ground. And these people didn't have their papers because there had been a hurricane, there's no more papers. And it's like, if you don't have the paper, you cease to exist in the system. You're just absolutely nothing suddenly.
Yeah, I think you see a similar thing. Like in the 1950s, there was this roundup in the US. It has a racist name, right? It's called Operation Wetback that the Border Patrol carried out in 1954. But during that, they deported a large number of American citizens of Mexican origin because they happened to find them on the streets without any sort of document. And since they couldn't prove that they were American, they just shipped them over to Mexico along with the other people that they were rounding up. So yeah, pieces of paper become these really significant documents in that sense.
This might be a really good point to segue into questions, but before we go to that, I want to thank you both for an absolutely fascinating conversation. The interplay between the work that you're doing, Reece, and Sonia's work is just there's just a lot of connections. I was thinking about something you said, Reece, about no borders, and I'm thinking, oh my God, I'm going to be out of a job because maps are just filled with borders. But I get where you're going. I know I've known you a long time, and I know that's a big part of who you are. It's in terms of kind of this utopia, really, where there are no borders, because as you know, geography does not know any borders. These are just constructs of ours. So I want to thank you, and for this for your book, and of course I'm going to have to read it twice, and then also Sonia, thank you for helping making this happen, and I'm of course interested now in your book as well. So this is really fantastic. What I'm going to do is pivot back to the question that we talked about with respect to Estonia's digital passport. Reread the question, and then go to a few others. I think there's one more, and then maybe more will pop up as we keep talking. So the question is, so in terms of migration and the easy movement of people, I would be curious to hear what the panelists think of the digital passport idea coming out of Estonia that encourages more movement, increases equity among passport holders, especially from folks from countries that have very strict visa privileges. So I went and looked at that site a while ago, and any person from basically anywhere that has an internet connection can get one of these, and there are some privileges attached to it. And so it's really not, it's exactly the opposite idea. It's not paper, right? You talk a lot about these pieces of paper. So that was the question. And I don't know if there's anything further to add from what you've said, but I wanted to kind of elucidate that a little more.
Yeah, so like I said, I'm not familiar with that particular concept, but it sounds really interesting, and I'll definitely have to look into it. I think that we can see lots of examples already, though, of what free movement across a boundary would look like, right? I mean, the US and Canada have more or less free movement between those two countries. It hasn't caused the US and Canada to cease to exist. Instead, it's developed stronger relations between those places. The US had free movement on the Mexico border until 1968. A lot of people don't realize that it wasn't until 1965 in that revision to the Immigration Act that immigration from Mexico was limited in any sort of way. Of course, people from Mexico had to get a permit to work in the United States, but there was free movement across the Mexican border until 1968. So it's not that long ago that was made illegal, right? Illegalized. And in the European Union as well, right? There's the EU has had the Schengen zone for 20 some years now, where people can move freely between different countries. There was a lot of worry at the start of that it would result in this kind of mad rush of people from poorer countries to wealthier countries. But the data suggests that didn't happen. That certainly there were movements, but until the British left the EU last year, the country that had the largest number of its citizens living in another EU country was actually the UK. So the largest exodus was British citizens moving to other EU countries, right? So the idea that the poor of Eastern Europe were going to flood into other parts of the EU just didn't play out, right? And then the flip side of that, we're seeing the impact that the UK, when they have now left that and don't have freedom of movement, it's having all kinds of problems, right? For example, there are no drivers to drive trucks in the UK right now, which is having all these economic problems. So cutting off free movement seems to have caused more problems than they anticipated.
Thanks for that. So a question that came on early in the talk, and this is for you, Reece. The questioner asked, you stated that the children of the Japanese men were born in Hawaii and therefore US citizens. However, if this was the 1920s, Hawaii was not a state till 1959. Please clarify how the children were considered US citizens.
Yeah, so birthright citizenship is put into law after the Civil War. as a concept, and then it's tested in the Supreme Court in the 1890s in Wong Kim Ark case, which confirms the idea of birthright citizenship. Hawaii became a territory in 1897, and so it was a U.S. territory at the time. And then in, I don't know the exact year, I apologize, but 1901, 1902, Congress passed a law extending birthright citizenship to people born in U.S. territories. And so after roughly 1902, anyone born in Hawaii or other U.S. territories became U.S. citizens on birth. Tequila Ozawa's children born after that period of time, I believe in the 19-teens, were U.S. citizens by birth.
Great, that clarifies that. I'm going to put a call out. If there are other questions for either Reece or Sonia, now's the time.
Can I ask Sonia a question?
Of course.
Yeah. So, well, Sonia, you're someone who I feel like you're always a few years ahead of what the big thing is going to be, right? You wrote a book about pandemics about 5-7 years ago. And then you have this great book about immigration and movement the last few years. So I wanted to ask you, what are you working on now? What will we all be talking about 3 or 4 years from now?
Well, I certainly did not think my book Pandemic would come true so fast, I have to say. It came out in 2016. So yeah, that was unexpected for sure. Although we knew enough to, for me to spend 5 years actually reporting on it because it was very well known what the risks were. And here we are today. Yeah, I'm working on a new book kind of exploring the human-animal divide a little more closely and how we've thought about humanness in relation to non-humanness. We talk about animals as if that's one whole thing and we are one species and animals are all the other tens of millions of other species, and sort of how that kind of idea of humanness came about, and how it has served us and how it is not serving us as we sort of wipe out so much wildlife habitat around the world. And, in this era of climate crisis and whatnot. So it's kind of trying to look back at that history of like all the reasons why we have argued for our uniqueness as a species and why we deserve to dominate the rest of the planet. We have language, we have culture, we have history. Nobody else has that. We have consciousness. Nobody else has that. We have opposable thumbs or, whatever it is. Science has found again and again and again that, well, no, there's other species to have that. Oh, no, there's other species to have that too. And other, so the basis for our ideas about our own specialness seem to be kind of sliding away beneath our feet. And where does that kind of leave us? So there's some of the ideas I want to explore. Who knows? What about you? Have you started? Or are you just going to take a breather now for a sec?
So I actually have another book that comes out in July. Because,
oh my God.
Yeah. So while I was writing this book, I also did a lot of work on racial profiling with the Border Patrol, because it fit with kind of the racial, enforcement of these immigration laws. And that section of the book kept growing and growing and growing to eventually I realized that's really a whole separate book. So I kind of took that out of this book and turned that into another book. So yeah, that comes out in July, which looks at the history of the Border Patrol from its foundings as this racial police force through the present day. In the 1970s, the Supreme Court heard a bunch of cases about the special rules that the Border Patrol have. If you look at maps of it, the Border Patrol can operate within 100 miles of borders and coastlines with these special privileges. So like the entire state of Hawaii is a border zone in that formulation. And in that area, they can use racial profiling and they can stop cars with much lower standards of evidence. And so in the book, I tell the story of how that became the law, how it came before the Supreme Court, and then the impacts that has on people's lives in that 100-mile zone through the present day.
Oh, wow, that's intense. So you wrote 2 books at the same time, essentially, over the past, how many? It's only been like 3 or 4 years since your last book came out, right?
Yeah, it's been 5 years. Yeah. So
okay, 5 years still.
Yeah. So I started them both at that 2016 when the Trump presidency, and then kind of realized about 2 years ago that it was two separate books. And so I finished this one first, and then the other one was 75% done. So it was really just kind of putting a start and a finish on it. So otherwise, this would have been a 600-page book, which I don't think anyone would want to read.
We'll look forward to that one.
Thanks.
Same here. So meanwhile, we've got a couple more questions. One is more of a comment. Maybe there's a question in there. This is from Riley Wieners, and she says, I'm fascinated by the idea of nations needing borders in order to materially exist. I originally wanted to ask about distinctions between more symbolic borders, so in parenthetics, tactics related to exclusion, and actual physical borders like a wall. But in this frame, it almost seems that all borders are imagined / symbolic to some degree. I'm curious about eugenics, for instance, as a philosophical border in preserving whiteness, directly following Madison Grant's book. So I guess maybe comments around that.
Yeah, I think there are a couple interesting thoughts in there. Maybe I could just talk a little bit more of the relationship between cartography, map making, and the way that we perceive states, because it's not by chance that the state system that we have today emerged just after cartographic advances allowed the depiction of large pieces of territory, right? So, and of course, Ptolemy in the Roman period could do quite extensive maps, but that sort of capability doesn't really come back into force until the 1500s in Europe, right? There's, as I'm sure the audience knows well better than I do, there are a lot of advances in that era. And that's the period where we start to see people using maps to divide up territory between different groups, right? So people often date the emergence of our current state system of bordered territories with exclusive sovereignty between different countries to the 1640s and 1650s, right? The Peace of Westphalia in Europe is an early example of that. And so that ability to draw a line on a map and say, this is mine, that's yours, and we agree to stay on either side of that, is very much tied to those really, they're imagined lines, right? They're cartographers sitting in a room, drawing this line on a piece of paper that then has to be created out there in the world. People have to go out there and locate where this place is, and then mark it on the ground, like the US-Mexico border. That border was agreed upon after the Mexican-American War and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, and then the Gadsden Purchase in the early 1850s. So Mexico and the US agreed where the border was on paper at that time, but they didn't actually go mark it for 40 years after that, right? It isn't until the 1890s that they really go and put down markers on where that border even exists. And it's for pretty obvious reasons. There were no laws about who could enter the country. So there's no real reason to mark where the border is. There were no border guards during that period of time, right? It's an open border. People could freely move across it. It didn't matter where it was, right? So it was just an imagined line that existed somewhere out there in the desert, but no one really knew exactly where it was on the ground, right? So it's only when there starts to be laws about who can cross that border that it's necessary to mark it. It's only when the US starts to have really strict rules about who can enter that it's necessary to put up fences on those walls and to increase the number of border guards. So yeah, it really is based on, I would say, an imagined idea that becomes powerful in our minds because of the way we depict it on a map, right? On the map, Mexico is red, the US is blue, there's a sharp line between them. There's a real difference between those things, even though on the ground that didn't exist for long periods of time. And even today, there's still large sections of that border that aren't marked in any sort of way, despite the fact that we've built many hundreds of miles of fences and walls down there.
Thank you, Reece. Next two questions also seem posed to you. One is, since a borderless wall is something that probably might not happen for a while, how do you suggest we humanize the existing border crossing process? And so particularly with regard to rights and dignity and in the context of American border laws, where all colored immigrants are treated, quote unquote, as a criminal.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is where the Biden administration has been so disappointing to me, because the language in the election was about doing a lot of these things, right? About dramatically increasing refugee quotas, about creating a path to citizenship for people who are currently in the country, and then creating mechanisms for people to move safely into the US. The US needs labor. It needs more people to work in jobs. And the way to solve that problem is to have a system for people to enter. I tend to be a little uncomfortable with some guest worker schemes because they often tend to be written in a way that benefits the companies much more than the people who are working in those schemes. But I could imagine a very fair guest worker scheme that could allow millions of people to come to the US to work. One thing that I think we tend to forget is that we often imagine migration as kind of this permanent thing. But I think the reality for a lot of people historically were temporary migrations, right? Whether, hunter-gatherers migrate to follow food sources. They're here for a period of time, then there, and then they go back. And it was the same thing for labor at the US-Mexico border for a long time. People would come to work briefly in the United States, and then they'd go home for a period of time. But now that it's become so difficult to cross that border, it's forced a lot of people to stay. They might not have wanted to be in the US for a 20-year period, but they had to be because it was so difficult to get back to their home if they were to go. So I think what we would find is a lot of people who might want to come to work in the United States would only want to come for a brief period to work and then would want to go back to their home, to their family, to their culture, to their language, to their way of life, right? And so it doesn't have to be a permanent immigration. Instead, we've kind of made it so people have to immigrate permanently because of the violence of borders themselves.
Thanks, Reece. The next question is to both of you, and perhaps Sonia, you can tackle this first. I'd be curious to hear the panelists' thoughts on the visa lottery and its impact, or lack thereof, on diversity of immigrants welcomed in the United States.
Well, I'm. It's not something the lottery is. My family's been in the lottery. It took 10 years for most of them to come over. So, to me, it's a drop in the bucket of the number of people who would want to move here, or who could move here, or who could be absorbed into our society. I think the big sort of missing piece in a lot of conversations about migration is that we only look at a tiny fraction of it and we focus all of our attention on that. So we look at, okay, asylum seekers, okay, these refugees. We look at the people who are poor, who are moving, who are brown, who are moving. What we're not looking at is all the other people who are moving all the time and are being absorbed and being assimilated. And it's just like the blood circulating in our veins and we don't even notice it. So it's really, when we think about migration as a peculiar phenomenon that's sort of anomalous, but really, if you look at the sort of broader picture of how much movement is happening and has happened in the past, in our own past, in nature more generally, and in history, when we talk about the visa lottery or the number of people we're letting in as refugees, it is just such a tiny fraction that I think it almost sort of vanishes into meaninglessness in terms of making an actual impact, on the scale of migration that we're going to need to accommodate in the future. One of the things I think, that we can't be said enough is that we don't really have a choice to say we don't want any migration. Migration is going to happen. We can just decide how it's going to happen. It can either happen as a series of catastrophes, which is sort of where we're going right now, where we're entrapping people, waiting until some horrible disaster comes, in which case they're completely desperate and they all have to move at once, as opposed to let's open up these channels, create pathways so people can start moving now more easily. And then we can manage migration. It can be, something that's dignified and humane and can add to diversity and resilience in the future.
Reece, before you address the question, I was just, really relating to you, Sonia, because I am in the same situation. I also came from a country that does not, we can't apply for the lottery. So this focus on, there's several blacklisted countries, if you want to call them that, where you cannot apply. Yeah, it's very, very interesting. Reece, your thoughts on the same question?
Yeah, I mean, I think Sonia's answer was quite elegant, and so I'm not sure that I have that much more to say to it. One thing I will say, even the 1965 Immigration Act, which we're still dealing with the categories that we have today because of that. We realize today that they resulted in a little bit more diverse immigration to the United States than had preceded that. But the intention in 1965 was not to create that. Instead, the rules that they put in place in 1965 were meant to protect a white country. And so it was not their intention to have a more diverse immigration pool. For example, they decided to use family reunification as the main category for visas coming to the US. The idea being in 1965, the US was about 90% white. And so the thought was mostly white citizens would be applying for these family reunification visas to bring in more relatives to the country. It hasn't turned out that way, but that was certainly the intention at the time. So even in these current laws that are not as racist as the previous ones were, there was still a racist intent when they originally implemented them.
And yeah, so related to that question, here's another one. What are both your thoughts about the visa system and how it contributes to racist immigration laws in general? Seems like you answered that in part already, but
yeah, I guess I saw that one coming. One other problem with the current system, and I think that Salim, in some ways, you're pointing toward that, is the current system has these caps on countries not based on the size of the countries, right? And so a country like India, for example, which has a very large population, has the same cap as Sri Lanka beside it, right? In terms of the number of visas per country per year. So there are all kinds of inequities in that system that are easily fixable if we could agree to make some reasonable changes to these immigration rules. But every time that comes up with these comprehensive immigration reforms, it gets torpedoed by these anti-immigrant groups. One thing though that I talk about in the book in White Borders over the last few years is the efforts by the Trump administration to make it so difficult, even within the laws that we have, for people to actually immigrate to the country. Stephen Miller had a meeting every Friday while he was in the White House, where he brought together people who shared his views about immigration, and they would come up with a game plan for the coming week for new things they could do within the system to restrict immigration. One example, I think, illustrates it really well, is they put in place a rule for immigration forms that you couldn't leave any blanks on the forms. Which that might sound reasonable, right? Okay, you should fill out the whole form if you're going to apply for immigration. But what that meant is, like, if you don't have a middle name and you left that blank on the form, they would reject it. If you didn't have an apartment number in the house you live in, if you left the apartment number space blank, they rejected your visa application. There was a space for 5 siblings on there. If you only had 1 sibling and you left the other 4 blank, they rejected your visa application, right? So the Trump administration put in all kinds of policies like that to, even within the numbers that we have today, really push down the number of immigrants to the country. And it worked for sure.
We are coming close towards end of time here, in terms of the session. Couple last questions. Let me start with the first one. Can you say more about susceptibility to anti-immigration arguments, claims, and so forth? It seems like there's a recurrent theme in recent US history anyway, with racist anti-immigration motives being a stealth agenda underneath something else that's used mainly as leverage. Maybe this isn't accurate.
Yeah, there's no doubt that an anti-immigrant platform is effective at rallying some percentage of the population in the US to support it, right? We saw that with the Trump success in the primaries, and then that carries into the election as a whole. But I think that we tend right now to overestimate the number of people that have those anti-immigrant views. For example, the Pew Foundation does a poll about views on immigrants, and they've been doing it for several decades. And the trend lines on that suggest that the country today is much more open to immigrants than it was a decade ago. I think for the first time, the number of people who say the U.S. should have more immigration is the highest category in their surveys, about a third of the population. Whereas a decade ago or 20 years ago, 2/3 of the population said that immigration should be reduced to the United States. So although the anti-immigrant voices are very loud and get a lot of press, and there's certainly a very vehement part of the population that supports that, I would suggest that the majority of people are actually in favor of more immigration.
Okay. Thank you, Reece, for that one. I'm going to end the session with a final question, and that's really apropos because both of you are authors, and this question is really relevant. So the question is, can you speak a little bit about the relationship between the nature of the work you do and your choice of publishers? As a young scholar also working on these issues, I always wonder who I should try to publish with if I want to make an impact, if I have to make an impact. Yeah. So Sonia, do you want to handle that first?
Well, I'm a science journalist, so I'm always trying to reach as many people as possible. I don't have other professional standards I need to meet, tenure or whatever. So for me, I'm always looking for a place that can distribute my work well, while also being a company, an organization that I trust with my words. So I've worked with a number of independent publishers, some smaller in the beginning when I was first starting out, and now with two largish independent publishers. And I'm really happy with Bloomsbury, and I was also really happy with Farrar, Straus Giroux, which was my publisher of the last two books before this one.
Yeah, I would reiterate what Sonia says, that it has a lot to do with what you want your audience to be for the book. I mean, for a scholar, and if you're thinking of an academic job and tenure after that, university presses are going to be the primary place to publish your work. But often they don't have quite the same reach in terms of audience that other publishers might have. So yeah, my newer books have been with these kind of larger independent presses. My last one was with Verso. This one is with Beacon, and then my next one next year is with Counterpoint Press. And I think they try to publish, serious nonfiction books, but ones that reach a broader audience, right? So White Borders is written in a narrative style, right, that tells the stories of the people whose lives are affected by these things, right, to make it both engaging, but also to convey this history that I tell in the book.
Great. Another question that snuck in, and since we have a little bit of time, if you guys don't mind, let's go for it. It relates to the visa system that we talked about moments ago. So the violence embedded in the visa system is equally applicable to non-immigrants who come to study on short-term visas. FHJ, I mean, I can tell you there's several. Sometimes such individuals stay for longer periods, 10+ years. What suggestions do you have to improve that system?
Yeah, I mean, my view is that all of these systems should be loosened up, right? And should be encouraging more people to come, right? So, my answer to any question about visas is there should be more, and they should not be as restrictive as they are, right? So, and student visas are a perfect example of that, right? I mean, the US has and California specifically has this top tier university system, and people around the world want to come to study in those places. And so the US should be working to connect those things, right? And should allow as many as possible to come to study at US universities, right? It contributes to the US economy. It educates the world, right? So, but I understand where this question is coming from, because many of those things have all kinds of strict limits to them, right? I mean, you can't do any work while you're here on some of those. Some of them you have to leave 2 weeks after the classes end and things like that. So, my view is all of those sorts of things should be loosened up and make it easier for people to move, because it benefits everyone.
Anything to add to that, Sonia?
No, I think that was a great place to end, actually.
That sounds good. Yeah, I was going to say that I believe at some point Australia had this law where basically, essentially, if you got a PhD, you end up getting a residency, right? It's just part of that whole pathways.